Most people hit a point in their career where something feels off, even when everything looks fine. And what's interesting is it can show up in two completely different ways, but underneath, it actually is the same thing. The first one is when you feel like you have outgrown your role. You have settled into the role and things are working fine. But slowly, something starts to shift. You notice that the work is no longer stretching you in the same way. Things that once felt challenging now feels like a routine. You are able to finish tasks faster, decisions around you take longer than they should, and you start feeling like you're waiting more than you're actually growing. It's not dramatic, but something has shifted. Almost like you have more to give, but there isn't enough space to use it. And at some point, a very quiet question starts to come up in your head. Is this it?
And then there's the exact opposite experience. You step into something new, maybe a new role, a new company, or even just a phase where everything around you suddenly starts to move faster. From the very beginning, you can feel the difference. Expectations are higher, timelines are tighter, and things are constantly changing. There's always something new to pick up, something new to respond to, and very little time to actually pause and process what's happening. So instead of feeling like you're waiting, you feel like you're always catching up. You go through your day trying to stay on top of everything, but it feels like there's always more coming at you. Even when you're putting in the effort, it doesn't feel like you're fully in control of your role yet. And that's when a different kind of question starts to show up. Am I actually ready for this? And the tricky part is, it doesn't feel like a pace issue, it feels like a you issue.
Now, what's interesting is how we interpret these two situations. In the first case, when things feel slow, we tell ourselves we have outgrown this. I need something more. And in the second case, when things feel fast, we go in the opposite direction and start thinking, maybe I'm not good enough for this yet. So even though the experiences feel completely different, the conclusion ends up being the same.
But what if both of these are actually coming from the same place? What if this isn't about whether you're capable enough or whether you've outgrown something? What if it's something much more simpler than that?
Because if you look at both situations side by side, there's one thing that stands out. In one case, things around you are moving slower than you are. In the other, things around you are moving faster than you are. And that gap, the difference is speed. This is what creates the feeling.
There's actually a pattern behind this. We call it a speed mismatch. Most people think that they have a career problem. What they actually have is most likely a pace problem. It's the gap between how fast you're growing and how fast your environment is actually moving.
And when those two don't match, that's when things starts to feel uncomfortable. And it's not immediately obvious, but internally something feels misaligned. And most people don't realize this. They think they are the problem.
And this is where most people get stuck because instead of looking at the situation itself, we immediately start questioning ourselves. We assume that if something feels off, it must mean we're actually doing something wrong.
But sometimes it's not about what you're doing, it's about the speed you're in.
And once you start looking at your experience through that lens, things begin to make a lot more sense.
And once you see this clearly, it changes how you look at your entire career. And that's exactly what we are going to break down today. So, welcome to the Transition Room. This is a space where we talk about the parts of your career that are often hard to explain, but real when you are going through them. These are the moments that are hard to explain, but very real when you're in them. And more often than not, the hardest part isn't just what you're experiencing, it's that you don't quite have the words to describe it.
And that's exactly why this space exists. Because once you can name what's actually happening, things actually start to become a lot more clearer. You stop going on in circles trying to figure out what's actually wrong with you, and you start looking at the situation itself with more distance and more clarity.
I'm Vidya, and in each episode, we take one of these moments and really break it down. Not just at the surface level, but what's actually happening underneath. What's driving that feeling and why it shows up the way it does.
And I'm Gandharvi. And today's topic is something a lot of people experience at different points in their career, sometimes more than once, but don't always recognize clearly when it's happening.
That feeling of either being ahead of your role or feeling that everything around you is moving faster than you can keep up with.
And instead of jumping to conclusions about what that says about you, we're going to actually slow this down and look at it a little more clearly.
Because once you understand what's actually going on in here, it becomes much more easier to figure out what to do next.
So let's break it down.
So, to understand this properly, let's simplify what's actually going on. At the moment, the basic level, there are two things at play. The first is your pace. This is how quickly you're learning, how fast you're picking up things, and how ready you feel to take on more. This is your internal speed.
And one reason this is hard to notice is because you don't experience space directly. You experience it through how your day feels, through how quickly things move, how much time you have to think, how often you feel settled versus rushed. So you don't sit there thinking, the pace is off. You just feel like something isn't quite clicking. And because that feeling is internal, it is very easy to assume that it must be coming from you.
And that's why people miss this for so long, because nothing clearly signals it. There's no obvious break, no moment where something fails. It's just a gradual shift in how the experience feels. And unless you step back and look at it, it's very easy to misread what's actually happening.
And the second is the pace of your environment. This is how quickly things move around you, how fast decisions are made, how often expectations change, and how much of your role actually evolves over time. It's the speed of the system that you're in.
And most of the time, we don't really think about these as two separate things. When something feels off at work, first instinct is to look at ourselves. We start asking, am I good enough? Am I growing fast enough? And am I good enough for this particular role?
But we rarely stop and look at the environment we're in and ask a different question. What is the pace here? And does it actually match where I am right now? We just assume we're the ones who always need to catch up.
And that difference matters more than most people actually realize. Because what looks like a performance issue on the surface is often just a mismatch in pace underneath. And when your pace and your environment pace are more or less in sync, work tends to feel quite natural. You're learning, and at the same time, your role is also expanding. You're being challenged, but it still feels manageable. There's a sense that things are moving forward in a steady way.
But when that balance starts to shift, the experience changes and it doesn't show up in a very obvious way. It's not like something clearly breaks or goes wrong. Instead, it shows up as a kind of ongoing discomfort that's hard to explain. You might feel restless or unsure or just slightly out of place. And usually, that feeling starts to go in one of two directions. Either it feels like things around you are moving too slowly and you're not being stretched enough anymore, or it feels like everything is moving too quickly and you're constantly trying to keep up.
And this is where we start to put a structure to it. A simple way to think about this is what we call pace versus your environment pace. So more simply put, your speed versus your system speed.
And when these two are aligned, you have what we call a good fit. A, a space where things feel challenging but not overwhelming. You're growing, but you're not constantly struggling to keep up. There's a rhythm to how these things move.
But when they're not aligned, that's when the friction starts. And this is important. That friction doesn't always mean something is wrong with you. Sometimes it just means your pace and the environment's pace are no longer matching.
There's actually a way to think about this more clearly. You can look at your situation as a kind of growth environment fit. It's not just about how capable you are, it's about whether your current environment can actually keep up with your growth or give you enough space to grow into it.
And once you start looking at it this way, the question changes. Instead of asking, what's wrong with me? You start asking, am I in sync with where I am right now?
It sounds like a really small shift, but it changes how you read the entire situation and it changes how you interpret everything that follows.
Because now, instead of trying to fixing yourself immediately, you're trying to understand the fit you're in.
And that's what we're going to build on next.
So let's start with the first situation. When your pace is faster than your environment's. This usually doesn't happen immediately, it builds over time. You've been in a role for a while, you understand how things work, and you've become comfortable with the level of responsibilities you actually have. At first, that feels like progress. You're learning, you're improving, and things are moving forward. But after a point, something starts to change. Your learning begins to slow down, even though your ability hasn't. The work that once challenged you starts to feel familiar. You're able to complete things faster with less effort, and there is less that feels new or stretching. And from the outside, everything looks stable, but your day to day experience starts to feel different.
What changes is not your performance, but how the work feels. You begin to notice that you're no longer being stretched in the same way. You can handle most situations without much effort, and over time, that creates a very specific kind of frustration. Not the kind that comes from being overwhelmed, but the kind that comes from not being used fully. You feel like you have more to give, but there isn't enough space to apply it. And this is where the question starts to show up. You ask yourself, is it me or is it the role? Am I being impatient or have I actually outgrown this?
But if we step back and look at it through the lens we discussed earlier, something else becomes visible. Your pace has increased, but the environment hasn't kept up. And when that happens, you don't feel stuck because you are failing, you feel stuck because you have stopped being stretched. There's a pattern behind this, and we call it stability trap. And there's also a timing element here that people don't always notice because this phase often comes after a period of strong growth. You have spent time learning, building capabilities, proving yourself. And for a while, the environment kept up with you. But at some point, your pace continues to increase and the environment starts to level out.
And when that happens, it's easy to misread the situation because, from your perspective, it feels like you're ready for more. But from the environment's perspective, things are working as they are. There's no immediate pressure to change anything. So, you and the environment are reacting to two completely different signals.
And that's what creates the gap. You're looking for growth. The system is optimized for stability. And both make sense on their own, but together they stop matching. This is when you become so reliable in your current role that the system starts to depend on you staying exactly where you are. You're doing things well, things are stable, and from the environment's point of view, there is no urgency to change anything.
So, even though you're ready to take on more, you're not always given the opportunity to move beyond what you're already doing. Not because you're not capable, but because the system is optimized for stability, not for your speed of growth. And there's another layer to this that people often miss. Sometimes it's not just about what you're doing, but also about what is visible.
You might be finishing your work quickly, solving problems efficiently, and handling things without needing much support. But because everything is running smoothly, it doesn't always stand out. There's nothing visibly urgent or critical about your contribution, even though it's valuable. And that's what we call the invisible contribution. Your work matters, but it's not always seen in a way that signals that you are ready for something more.
So, from your perspective, you feel ready to move forward. But from the outside, it can look like you're already exactly where you're supposed to be. And that's the frustrating part. You're ready to move, but nothing around you is. Over time, this gap starts to grow. You have the capacity to move forward, but the environment continues at the exact same pace.
And what you experience then is not failure, it's stagnation. And if you don't recognize this early, it slowly turns into disengagement. Not because you don't care, but because the environment is no longer moving with you.
And this is important to understand clearly because what feels like restlessness or even impatience might actually just be a signal that your pace has changed and the environment hasn't caught up with you yet.
Now, let's look at the other side of this. When the environment is moving faster than you are, this often happens when you step into something new. It could be a new role, a new team, or even just a phase where the pace of your work suddenly increases. And from the beginning, you can feel the difference. Things move quickly, expectations are high, and there's very little time to pause and fully process what's happening. You're being asked to learn, adapt, and deliver almost at the same time. At first, this can feel exciting. It feels like you're being pushed, like you're growing. But after a point, it starts to feel different because you don't get enough space to fully settle into what you're learning. Instead of building momentum, it starts to feel like you're constantly reacting. You're trying to stay on top of things, but there's always something new coming at you. And even though you're putting in the effort, it doesn't feel like you're fully in control of your role.
And this is where the experience starts to turn inward. Instead of looking at the environment, you start doubting yourself. You think, maybe I'm not ready for this. Maybe I'm not learning fast enough. Maybe I'm not as capable as I thought. And that shift is important because it changes how you interpret what's happening. What you're experiencing feels like a personal failure. It's coming from a lack of space to grow at your own pace. If we go back to the model for a moment, there's another way to look at it. It's that the environment is moving faster than your current pace of learning and adjustment.
And there's actually a pattern to this as well. We call this the pressure cooker. This is when everything around you is happening at a speed that doesn't give you enough time to absorb, understand, and grow into your role properly.
And something else that makes this harder is that this phase often comes with visibility. You're in a role where expectations are high, where your work matters, and where people are paying attention. So the pressure doesn't just come from the work itself, it comes from how visible that work actually is.
Which means the experience is not just fast, it feels exposed. You're learning in real time while also being evaluated in real time. And that combination can make it feel like you're constantly behind, even when you're actually progressing.
And over time, that can distort how you see yourself. Because instead of noticing what you're learning, you focus on how often you feel like you're catching up. And those are not the same thing.
You're still learning, but it doesn't feel steady. It feels rushed. And over time, that doesn't just affect your work, it starts affecting how you see yourself, not just from the work itself, but from the constant feeling that you're falling behind.
And this is where another layer shows up, which people often don't recognize immediately. It's not just stress, it's not just tiredness, it's the effect of being in continuous change without enough space to process it. You're constantly adjusting, constantly catching up, and over time, that starts to wear you down. This is sometimes referred to as change fatigue, not because you can't handle change, but because the pace of change doesn't give you enough time to actually adapt.
And when that happens, it might actually just be a difference in pace, not a lack of ability, but a lack of alignment between how fast you can realistically grow and how fast the environment that you are in is demanding it. And once you see that clearly, the question starts to change. Instead of asking, am I good enough? You start asking, is this a pace I can grow into, or is it too much, too fast right now? So, when you look at both of these situations side by side, something important starts to become clear. In one case, you feel underused. In the other, you feel stretched. But in both cases, the instinct is exactly the same. You question yourself. When things feel too slow, You tell yourself you've outgrown the role and need more and to move on immediately. When things feel too fast, you start questioning whether you even belong there. And both of these reactions feel very valid when you're in them. They don't feel like assumptions, they feel like conclusions. But what looks like a problem with you is often just a mismatch between you and the environment. You are either telling yourself that you need more or telling yourself that you are not enough. And both of those explanations miss something very important.
The mistake here is not that you're looking for answers. It's that you're only looking at yourself, because the same person with the same ability can have completely different experiences in different environments. In one place, the person could feel stuck. In another, they could feel overwhelmed, not because they've suddenly changed, but because the pace around them has changed. And that's where the shift happens. Instead of asking what's wrong with me, you start asking a very different question: is this the right pace for me right now? And that question opens things up in a completely different way, because now you're not immediately trying to fix yourself. You're trying to understand the relationship between you and the environment that you're in.
And this is the part that changes everything, because sometimes it's not the wrong role, it's not the wrong person, it's the wrong speed. And once you see it that way, the pressure starts to come down. You're no longer stuck in that loop of constantly trying to adjust yourself without even understanding what you're adjusting to. You start to look at the situation more clearly. You start to ask better questions. And most importantly, you stop treating every uncomfortable experience as a personal failure. Because what you're dealing with here is not a lack of ability, it's a mismatch of timing and not talent. And that distinction is what allows you to move forward with a lot more clarity.
So, once you recognize that there's a mismatch in pace, the next question is natural. What do you actually do about it? And this is where it helps to keep things simple. Because in most situations, you're not dealing with 10 different options. You're really choosing between three paths. And one thing that's important here is that the right choice is not about what sounds better. It's about what fits your situation right now, because the same person might need to stretch in one situation and move in another.
And that's why it's useful to look at this honestly instead of reactively. Because if you misread the situation, you end up choosing the wrong response. You might try to stretch in an environment that doesn't support growth, or decide to move what you have actually built instead of needing a little bit more time to settle in.
And both of those come from the same place, trying to solve the feeling without fully understanding what's causing it. And the mistake most people make is trying to apply the same solution to all three. You either adjust to the pace you're in, you stretch yourself to meet it, or you move to a different environment where the pace is a better fit. And the important thing here is not to jump to a decision too quickly, but to understand what each of these paths actually mean.
So let's start with the first one, which is adjusting. This is when you decide to work with that pace that you're currently in instead of constantly resisting it. If things feel slower than you would like it, adjusting might mean finding ways to stay engaged within the role. It could be taking more ownership of something new within your current scope of work, doing deeper work into areas you haven't explored yet. So, simply changing how you approach work so it can still feel meaningful to you. And if things feel faster than you are comfortable with, adjusting may look very different. It's less about pushing harder and more about stabilizing, giving yourself the space to settle into the role, focusing on understanding before trying to optimize, and following your pace to build gradually instead of expecting yourself to match everything immediately. This path works best when the gap between your pace and the environment's pace is there, but it's still manageable. Some situations are asking you to understand better because sometimes the goal is not to move faster, it's to move more steadily.
The second option is to stretch. And this usually comes up when the environment is moving faster than you are, but in a way that you feel you can grow into. Stretching means you're intentionally choosing to close that gap. You're putting in extra effort to learn, asking more questions, seeking clarity faster, and being more deliberate about building the skills you actually need. But this is important. Stretching only works when there is enough support around you. If the expectations are high, but there's no space to learn, no guidance, and no room to make mistakes, then stretching very quickly turns into exhaustion. Growth only works when the environment supports it. Otherwise, it just feels like pressure. So the question here is not just can I push myself more, but also is this an environment where pushing myself will actually lead to growth?
And then there's the third option, to move. This is when you recognize that the mismatch isn't temporary. And one way to recognize this more clearly is to look at whether anything is actually changing. If you've been feeling this mismatch for a while, and the structure of your role, the expectations, and the pace of your environment are all staying the same, then it's less likely that this will resolve on its own.
And that's an important signal because it tells you that this is not just about adjusting yourself. It's about recognizing that the environment itself is not designed for the pace you need.
It's not just a pace, and it's not something that's going to resolve with smaller adjustments. The pace is either constantly too slow or no real change in sight, or constantly too fast in a way that it doesn't give you enough space to grow properly. And in those situations, staying and trying continuously and trying to adjust can feel more exhausting because the problem isn't going away. Not every situation needs more effort. Some situation needs a different environment.
And this is where it's important to shift how you think about moving. Moving is often seen as giving up, or not being able to handle the situation. But in reality, it's not about failure. It's about recognizing that your pace and the environment space are not aligned and choosing to find a space where they are closer to each other. And that doesn't always mean making a drastic decision immediately. Sometimes you adjust, sometimes you stretch, and sometimes you move on. But the key is knowing which situation you're actually in instead of reacting based on how you feel in the moment. Because once you see the mismatch clearly, the decision becomes a lot less emotional and a lot more practical. You're no longer trying to prove something about yourself, you're trying to find the right fit for how you grow.
So, before we close, it's worth taking a moment to step back and look at your situation because this is one of those things that can feel very clear when you hear it, but much harder to notice when you're in the middle of it. A simple place to start is to look at how your day to day experience actually feels right now. Not what it looks like from the outside and not what you think it should feel like, but what is genuinely feeling like when you're in it. Does it feel slow? Like you're no longer being stretched in a way that you once were? Does it feel like you've been waiting more than you're growing, even though you're doing everything that's expected out of you? Or does it feel fast, like you're constantly trying to keep up, and even though you're putting in the effort, it never quite feels like you have caught up fully? And just noticing that honestly, without immediately trying to fix it, is already a useful starting point. Because clarity doesn't come from rushing to an answer, it comes from seeing your situation as it is.
And once you have a sense of that, the next step is to look at how long this has been going on. Because there's a difference between something that is temporary and something that is part of the environment you're in. Every role has phases where things feel slower or faster for a while. That by itself doesn't mean there's a deeper issue. But if it has been your consistent experience over time, if you've been feeling this way for months and the pattern doesn't really change, then it's likely that you're looking at something structural and not just situational. And that distinction matters because it changes how you actually respond to it.
And then the final question becomes much more simpler one. Given where you're right now, what do you actually need? Do you need to adjust? and find a way to work more efficiently within the pace you're already in? Or do you need to stretch because the pace is challenging but still something you want to grow into? Or are you at a point where the mismatch is too consistent and what you really need is a different environment altogether? And there isn't a single right answer here. But asking these questions honestly gives you a lot more clarity than staying in that loop of assuming something is wrong with you.
Because the goal here is not to force a decision. It's to understand your situation clearly enough that whatever decision you make actually fits where you are. And once you have that clarity, the next step tends to become much more obvious.
This is one of those things that's very easy to miss when you're in the middle of it. But how it feels on the inside is often telling you a very different story. And that feeling is usually not random. It is pointing to something about the pace you're in and whether it actually matches where you are right now.
And sometimes just having the right way to look at it makes a big difference. It takes you out of that constant loop in your head and helps you see the situation more clearly. Not as something you need to immediately fix, but as something you need to understand first. Because once you understand it, the next step becomes much more easier to figure out. And if you've been listening to this, you probably already have a sense of where you are. Either things feel slower than your pace, and you're not being stretched in the way you once were, or things feel faster than you'd like, and you're constantly trying to catch up without ever quite feeling settled.
So instead of overthinking it, for everybody who is listening, just name it clearly. You can drop one word in the comments saying if you're ahead and if things feel slower than your pace, or comment catching up if things feel faster than you'd like. You don't need to explain your whole situation. Just identifying it clearly is a strong first step.
And if you're in that space where it's been going on for a while and you're not sure what to do next, this is exactly the kind of situations we work on at Gavira. Not when things are clearly broken, but when something doesn't feel right and the decision matters. Because most people don't need more effort at this point, they need to see their situation clearly.
And once that clarity is in place, the next steps don't feel as confusing or heavy because you're no longer trying to fix yourself, you're trying to find the right fit.
And if you're navigating a transition of your own, you don't have to do it in isolation. Because this isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking better questions and giving yourself permission to respond differently to what you're experiencing. And the decisions you're making right now are not just about what comes next, they're shaping who you're becoming. This is the transition room, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.
Bye bye.